Hello again, everyone. It's Mr. Most Days Off, and I am back for another episode of the Best Darn Diddly Review Show. We are kicking off Season 2 of The Simpsons with a bang. We've got a couple of gems, Bart Gets an F, and Simpson and Delilah. But before we dive into that, I've got a couple of introductions to make. First off, as usual, your co-host with the most, Richie the Whiz Kid. How are you today, Rich?
I am excited. This is going to be a very fun show today. So I'm not going to waste any time. I'll throw it back to you ASAP, the man, the myth, the Mo Sizzlack. It is Miles, Mr. Most Days Off.
Nice. We also have a very special guest with us today, a man whose childhood memories, like my own, are tinted green, specifically Nickelodeon slime green. So much so that this cat wrote a book about it. The author of Slimed, an oral history of the golden age of Nickelodeon, Mathew Klickstein. Welcome to the show, Matthew.
Thanks, Miles. Thanks, Richie. I appreciate your having me on the show here. This will be great.
Awesome, man. Yeah, we're really excited to have you. I forgot to add on the, not only did he write a book about Nickelodeon, he's also a big-time Simpsons fan. And why don't we start by having you just tell everybody a little bit about yourself and also your relationship with The Simpsons.
Certainly. As you said, I am the author of Slimed, an oral history of Nickelodeon's golden age. I guess I have to do the extra plug. If anyone hasn't read it yet, definitely check it out. We talked to about 250 different people involved in all aspects of the 80s and some of the early 90s Nickelodeon. Clarissa Explains It All, Ren and Stimpy, Double Dare, of course, a number of other shows. Even some of the more obscure, really early ones like Out of Control with Dave Coulier, and of course You Can't Do That on Television.
Where all the slime originated.
Yeah, absolutely, and had a blast doing that. It's been a big part of my life and really changed the trajectory of my life. I've met a lot of fascinating people like yourselves and Marc Summers. He and I have become very close over the years. We're actually now, we can maybe talk about this a little later if you want, but we're actually now finishing a documentary about Marc Summers, of course, host of Double Dare and Food Network's Unwrapped.
Dude, I'm marking out a little bit right now that you just put us in the same category as Marc Summers.
I was having the exact same thought. You mentioned us in the same breath, and I feel honored now.
You know, I have to say, it's incredible the number of people I've met through the Nickelodeon book, because I've never really been much for social media and a lot of online community communication and the like, and you know, I've never really been big into conventions and things like that. My dad was actually really into that when I was a kid. I think he kind of tired me out of it. He was the one always pulling me to baseball card conventions and Magic the Gathering conventions and video game conventions when I was a kid. And so I guess maybe to rebel against him in some way, I was never really that into the scene. But after I did the Nickelodeon book, that world opened up for me in a big way. And I've traveled all over the country and met so many different people. And so, yeah, whether it's Marc Summers or Miles and Richie, I've really enjoyed the ride. And I just feel really lucky that, you know, I get to do things like this. And, you know, as far as The Simpsons is concerned, just like with Nickelodeon, probably most people of our generation grew up on the show, was a fan from moment one. I remember when it was still kind of naughty to watch the show. You'd get in trouble at school or, you know, some friends' parents wouldn't let you watch it if you were over at their house and whatnot back in the day. When it still was like bad to watch The Simpsons, heaven forbid. And so, you know, I've been there since moment one. Another, just not necessarily through my Nickelodeon work, but through some other odd series of circumstances. I'm also a journalist full time. And so I've actually gotten to be friendly with some of the people from The Simpsons. Maggie Roswell, who does the voice of Maude Flanders, and Milhouse's mom, and Reverend Lovejoy's wife, and a number of other characters. Sherry Bobbins, of course, and Mike Reese. Yeah, Mike Reese, who's been one of the main writers since day one, with Al Jean, his writing partner. Really, really great guy, and just always very funny, very interesting. So, you know, Simpsons is a big part of my life even now as an adult. Without question. That's why, Miles, when you asked me if I want to do this, I said absolutely, because you know, I feel strongly that Simpsons greatly informed my perspective on life, my sense of humor, and I think that it had a similar effect on a lot of people in our generation, and maybe a little bit the generation before us and after as well. I think the world would be a much, much different place, and probably not nearly as funny or irreverent if we hadn't had The Simpsons there to grow up with.
We kind of have a running joke on this show where we say Simpsons did it, which is actually a South Park episode, of course.
Sure.
But you're absolutely spot on, and there's so many things that we won't even mean to, and it'll just come up in conversation, and it's like, well, shit, the Simpsons did do that first. Like,
Yeah.
it's crazy. It's crazy how much they've influenced, as you mentioned, our generation, anyone in their young 30s, late 20s, probably. It's influenced all of us so much. Even if you were never a fan, you at some point were probably bombarded with Simpsons memorabilia or Simpsons. I mean, hell, the Universal Studios has literally Springfield built. So like, if you go to their park, you can walk into Moe's Tavern and have a beer. It's everywhere. It's really amazing.
As long as it's Duff.
Yeah. But we are super thrilled to have you, man. I'm just a really big fan of your book. I'm also a Nick kid. I read your book, and I just reached out to you on Twitter, and I was super thrilled that you were down to do this. So let's dive into our first episode, Bart Gets an F. That debuted on March 11th, 1990. Kicks off season 2. We have a new, shorter intro to give them a little bit more time in the actual show. Our chalkboard gag for this one is I will not encourage others to fly. And we finally get a real couch gag. I've been complaining all throughout season 1 that I did not remember that those hadn't started up yet. But in this case, all the Simpsons jump onto the couch, and it does, in fact, collapse through the floor. We open up with Martin Prince giving a in-character book report from Ernest Hemingway, very clearly setting the bar pretty high. And then, of course, our lovable, not-so-great student Bart Simpson has to follow with his book report on Treasure Island, and it very quickly becomes apparent that Bart did not do his assignment.
Yeah, he certainly is he certainly is an underachiever and proud of it. And they make that little joke about it with the psychologist in this episode. I actually remember I had to borrow a friend of mine's shirt one morning during a really busy hustle and bustle of getting to school. I had slept over at his house, or he slept over at mine or something when we were still kids, and I ended up with his underachiever and proud of it shirt. And my mom, who was fine with me watching The Simpsons, she was the kind of mom who let me watch whatever for good or ill. She was actually a little upset about that particular shirt. Like, I'm Bart Simpson, who the hell are you? That's fine. But underachiever and proud of it, she actually was not so cool about that, because I think she didn't want me to actually start to ascribe to that or emulate that philosophy. But I remember that moment in this episode, and when the psychologist actually says it. And, I think that's a lot of what the theme of the episode is Bart's dealing with, is he really proud of being an underachiever? Is he really an underachiever at all,
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And it's you mentioned earlier in the intro talking about how it felt a little bit naughty back then to watch The Simpsons,
yeah.
And then also with the shirt. It's funny you mentioned that, because actually on IMDb, James L. Brooks talks about during the summer of 1990, that's when they were really at the peak of getting a lot of backlash against Bart Simpson. And in particular, that shirt you mentioned, the I'm Bart Simpson, who the hell are you? And also, I'm an underachiever and proud of it. There were schools that were going up in uproars, banning anything that had Simpsons on it. And James L. Brooks was often pressured into, to make changes, and a lot of people asked if this episode was in fact a response to that backlash. He claimed it was not, but they were mindful of it. And what I found interesting is they made it a point that they wanted to make sure that it was clear that Bart was a bad student and he wasn't a role model. And James L. Brooks was quoted saying he doesn't understand the fascination with role models in television. There aren't that many real-life role models. Why should there be so many on TV?
I actually I read that as well, looking into this episode and kind of doing a little bit of quick research for the podcast. And I actually really appreciate that. That's something actually a lot of people don't realize this, and it came up in some questions for early Nickelodeon. In fact, I just answered almost this exact question with an interview about something separate not too long ago, which is, they were intentionally not educational at Nickelodeon, or at least so they claimed. And they really wanted Nickelodeon. That's what was going to make it different from more the kind of staler, if you will, PBS, your obvious shows like Sesame Street and the like. They really wanted those early Nickelodeon shows to just be about fun, to just be about having a good time, having kind of a break from the hurly-burly day at school and so forth. And so I see the same kind of affinity for that lifestyle with The Simpsons, where it's, no, this really, like, Bart is a bad kid and he is a bad student, and those exist. And that's a part of our lives and a part of our world as well. And I think it's one of the reasons that people like yourself and myself, I think, respond so well to South Park, because there's a real element to South Park of, like, these are little bastards, you know, they make fun of each other, they fight with each other, and they break things, and they push each other down, and they make fun of each other, and, you know, that's a part of life for many of us, and I think most of us.
That was my friends when we grew up. We would, I mean, you know, I'm going to use some politically incorrect words, but keep in mind we were 8, but yeah, we would call people pussy and faggot and things like that on the schoolyard. And that was just part of growing up. You had to kind of learn to either toughen up and deal with that, or people would kind of latch on to that and realize, oh, he's really affected by those words. We should call him more hateful things. And you really had to kind of toughen up to get through the schoolyard back in the day.
No, and I really appreciate that they did that on The Simpsons, and that James L. Brooks made such a point about it. You know, even when I was younger, and again, probably like you guys and some of your listeners, I was a bit precocious as a kid, and even though I was mischievous.
I wouldn't know anything about that, Matthew.
Even though I was mischievous and whatnot, and would sometimes get in trouble at school and the like, I was still, you know, an advanced student, if you will. I was in some advanced classes, and I did enjoy reading, you know, the newspaper and magazines, and, you know, I was, 7, 8 years old, and so I knew a lot about some of the background that was going on at The Simpsons and other favorite shows and films that I was into. And this was, you know, pre-internet, so you really had to reach out for that kind of stuff. And I would pay attention when these things were on the news or whatever it would be. And so, I remember those kinds of statements coming out a lot, that they were unapologetic about how they were developing the show. And it was not just, oh, whoops, we went too far. It was, no, this is real, and we need to show this element of childhood. And I think that's really important. You know, I think... You know, I obviously I can ramble, but to wrap this part of it up, I think one thing I learned recently that's really fascinating, and I wish they would deal with more in these kinds of stories about childhood, is in the original novel and story of Peter Pan, Peter was much more of a little dick in the original text than he was in subsequent films and the like, because Barry really wanted to show that as a child you are a selfish little prick, and he really wanted to exemplify that in Peter as the embodiment of childhood. And there's actually a scene in the original story where he basically forgets that he's flying with Wendy and the boys, and they start to fall, and he's not paying attention to them because he just doesn't think about them, because he's thinking about himself. And they kind of play that up a little bit in the Steven Spielberg movie Hook, where, you know, the longer you're in Never Never Land, you start to forget the other people in your life. But that was a big part of the original Peter Pan mythos that they've kind of left out, because I think people are afraid to admit that a lot of children are kind of little bastards. And I really like that they were true to form with that, with not, you know, South Park obviously, but also early Simpsons, and were unapologetic about it. It made it more realistic.
My thing about this first scene with the book report is I feel like at least a lot of people's kids that I know these days, and Bob's Burgers had an episode about this. The book report Bart gave is pretty spot on to what I hear out of kids these days. I mean, he literally just read right off the front and back cover and tried to pass it off, and everything I've heard, that's all you have to do now anyway, so...
Well, I'm pretty sure it's not okay or acceptable for a teacher to fail a child anymore in the politically correct climate that we're now in, because that would, you know, be a danger to their safe space or something. I'm really not sure. But regardless, moving on, we quickly learned that this is not Bart's first time to fail a book report. In fact, he's got a long history of doing very poorly in school. And the teacher essentially tells him that he has a test tomorrow, and that if he fails, it's going to be bad news, more or less. So Bart is starting to get in his mind that he needs to make sure to pass his class, but lo and behold, everything in the world that could possibly distract him just gets in his way. I think he had like a 5 spot at the arcade because a ton of coins.
Yeah, so many coins
when he
come
put that
out.
bill in.
That is a ridiculous amount of coins.
I as a kid, like, I was lucky to have $1.
Yeah.
Like, I'd be like, I was thinking, he said a couple more games, so I'm like, all right, he'll go put a buck in.
Yeah.
And then it was like hitting the freaking jackpot at a slot machine based on how they came out.
Right.
But regardless of all that, his dad distracted him. He had him watch a movie. They ended up having like extra yum dinner. Oh,
Homer got really intense with that movie too.
Yeah, he was so upset. Just because the gorilla was different.
It's fun to see the softer side of the below average beast.
I also love that line that Mrs. K had with Bart, where she was doing her blah 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 blah. She goes, "Bart, what did I just say? Straighten up and flat right?"
That's a lucky guess.
Since I was a kid, I've always remembered that part. That just cracks me up every time.
That's where I learned that line. I never knew what that meant before.
So Bart ends up falling asleep while trying to study for the test, wakes up in a panic the next morning. One of my favorite parts, he actually tries to convince Otto to wreck the bus so that he could get out of his test. And Otto is like, sorry, little buddy, I can't wreck it on purpose, but hey, maybe you'll get lucky.
Right. Yeah. I love the way that Otto starts to develop. He's a great character.
Oh, yeah, dude. And it all culminates in the Simpsons movie when he finally hits the bong on Simpson. That's the ultimate Otto moment for sure.
And then we have Sherry and Terry being like their sneaky, mean characters again in the bus.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is the first time we really get that dark side of them, isn't it?
No, we got it in season 1 when they were kissing him on the bus to get him riled up. When Mrs. K told him to quiet down.
You're so right. You're so right. Yeah, this just built on that. They basically give him a lot of really terrible information for the test, and for whatever reason, Martin warns him that he's been duped, and sure enough, he has been. Bart fakes being sick, and there's a really funny moment where he's basically allowed to go to the nurse's office, and when he arrives, the nurse is picking up all the tongue depressors off of the floor. You got to save that money. But then she essentially does the equivalent of modern day people WebMDing themselves, and she finds all of his symptoms and immediately assumes the worst.
Don't we all want that?
And Bart gets out of school for a while. Oh my god, wouldn't that have been fantastic? And then his mom is like offering to like bring the TV up to his room. What the hell was that about? My mom would have never done that.
And that's a pretty new TV from a few episodes ago. They just used the $500 to get that one.
Oh yeah, that's a good point. I never thought about that.
Yeah, that's a brand new box.
Wasn't it 25 inches or something, I think?
Yeah, it was comically small by today's standards. I remember that. It was their big upgrade.
And Bart's eating all that ice cream. Well, I think it's an intriguing point. I think I told you, Miles, fun little aside here on a personal level. I still to this day don't really know why, but the hardest class I ever had in my entire life, and friends of mine who I grew up with agree with this, and some of them are lawyers now, doctors, other, also writers, filmmakers, whatever, like a pretty a smart batch of kids who are now adults. They all agree that my 7th grade history class was the hardest class we ever took. And just the teacher he was great, but he was really tough. And we watched this episode, Bart Gets an F in class. And it really had nothing to do, aside from that little, peripheral anecdote about history and whatnot that Bart's learning about. We really didn't talk about that. We just kind of talked more about the dynamic between Martin and Bart. And I think he was just trying to prove some kind of point about bullies or about, being yourself or something or other. I still don't really know why, but we really watched that episode like we were watching a documentary and kind of deconstructed it afterwards and talked about it. But I'll never forget the teacher, though. He made a good point. He goes, Bart's not necessarily dumb. He's actually shrewd. That was the word he used. He said Bart knows how to get what he wants. You know what I mean? Whether it's the TV, whether it's the ice cream, whether it's getting out of the test, Bart's actually fairly shrewd. And so it's almost as though I wouldn't be surprised if Bart actually secretly, reads certain books or watches certain movies and just doesn't tell anybody. He seems like an idiot, but actually he's fairly well spoken. Because every now and then he pulls out a reference or an idea or a word where you go, wait a second, this kid's actually kind of smart. He knows what he's talking about, just what he wants to know about, not what anybody else wants him to know about. So I think that's an interesting point too.
I think that's spot on, and in addition to that, he's also just really good with people in general
Yeah.
and knowing what to say and what to do to get his point across with individuals. And we see that later in the episode, as you pointed out a little bit, that when he essentially realizes that him and Martin can help each other out, because we'll get to this, but Bart needs to get his grades up to pass and not have to repeat the 4th grade, and Martin didn't realize that he's a Poindexter, and Bart makes that apparent and then shows him how not to be one.
Right.
And that moment, you can really see. I wrote down it shows how Bart's brain works. And you're right. It's not like he's a Martin Prince. He's not a traditional intelligent person, but he's definitely not an idiot.
He's a real brain person, almost, you could say. I wrote down a note saying, by today's standards, don't you think Bart would be labeled as ADHD?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, but I was going to go further with that. I think that Bart, they always show all these episodes of the future, and Bart's always in a really bad place for the most part. I think Bart would actually be pretty successful. I could see Bart being, he could be the sort of person where I could see him growing up to become, a salesman or even maybe some kind of a lawyer. He'd be one of those people who, goes to these speaking engagements and talks about how when he was a kid he struggled because he had dyslexia or ADD or whatever it might be. But, he got through it at a point. And, with the right teacher, with the right mentor, with the right older friend, or maybe the right teacher at some point later down the road, I think that Bart could actually really hone his skills. Because I agree with you, Miles. He's definitely a good schmoozer. He's got some real savoir-faire. Sometimes he's friends with the bullies even and other people at his school and different tribes and the like, if you will. And, he is able to, plot and he is a schemer. And that takes some creativity. That takes some innovation. So I think he has a good brain. I think he has a good intellect. He just doesn't really know how to apply it because he has nothing to apply it to. And, that's another thing I really connected to with this show and his character and some of the other characters on the show is, again, growing up, I was always in the smarter classes, but I would still get in fight after fight with my teachers, well through high school, actually. And it was never because they were mean or because something was hard or whatever. It was, I honestly felt that many of them weren't doing a very good job. And, I've since kind of grown out of this, of course, now that I'm a grown man. But when I was a kid, when I was younger, even into my early teens, it was just hard for me to stand by and watch these, teachers bungling, over what they were doing. And, it was like, God, you guys are doing a terrible job of teaching us, do a better job. And so I could see Bart being like that, maybe when he gets to high school, he'll actually be doing a lot better and just, will be fighting with teachers, not about his grades or about, them being mean or anything, but about, he wants to do better and they're not giving him the opportunity to do so.
It's the standardized test formula there. Just get him to pass.
I absolutely agree with all of that. I think that Bart would, again, assuming that he at some point came across some sort of mentor, because you're right, he needs something to guide him, and unfortunately Homer just isn't going to cut the mustard in this category. But I think if you had the right person kind of pointing or directing that intelligence that Bart does has, his own unique kind of brain, if you will, and somebody who was able to help him mold that towards towards a goal, as you said. If they could just get him on a track, he would probably be quite successful. And I also had sales in mind, as I thought, I bet you as an adult that dude could basically, the proverbial ice to an Eskimo, if you will.
We all know Lisa becomes president and gives him a little job at the end of that episode, so he does just fine for himself later on. He can say "smell you later" to everybody.
Yeah. Isn't he with a band with Martin? Was it Martin?
Ralph.
No, it was Ralph. That's right.
Ralph.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. No, and it's funny because obviously it's become pretty in vogue, or maybe now the opposite of just because it's been a little overdone. But when you read about the life story of some of these people like Steve Jobs, I mean, it's very similar. He didn't get along with a lot of people when he was younger, and he had trouble with authority and the like. But the people he did get along with, he was really close with, and Wozniak was almost like his Millhouse. You know what I mean?
Oh,
nice.
Man. Oh man.
Nice.
So and look what happened to him, and he really and look, he would be the first to say. I mean, Steve Jobs said in interviews, I know I'm an asshole, but he also completely revolutionized the world. And say what you will about iPhones and the like. I personally don't even have an iPhone, but He made his impression. He made the dent on the universe that he always claimed he was going to make, for sure. And, good or bad, asshole or not, he made some really big things happen in the world. And, I could see that happening with Bart. And I think that's, again, why people like we and others, really connected with Bart. And because we kind of saw, like, hey, you can be the quote-unquote bad kid, or you can be the kid in the back of the room or whatever it is, or the back of the bus, and still actually be kind of smart, though. Because he's not, the bully kids. And he's not, like, he can push Martin down. And there are certainly episodes where he can be a real, pretty bad guy to Lisa or to Milhouse or whatever it is. But for the most part, you have the sense that he's got a good heart. He's got a good brain. He's just a little confused. And I agree, Miles, that, what it comes down to is he just needs the right kind of mentor, the right guide. Certainly it's not going to come from Homer. And, he just doesn't have the opportunity for someone around him who can point him and say, hey, you know what? Like, I was a little dick when I was a kid too, but now look how well I'm doing. If you just do this, that, or the other, here's how to play the game so that you can get in there. And then, you got to get to the table first, then you can make a mess. If he just has someone to say that in his life, I think Bart would do very well. So, hopefully it comes along at some point. Unfortunately, as we know, I don't think there's anyone like that in Springfield. I think the whole town is just, a dystopia at its worst. That's what makes it so funny. But, I'd like to think Bart will be okay.
There is an episode from the last, I don't know if it's the last 5 or 10 years, where Super Nintendo Chalmers actually takes the boys outside and gets them to learn about, it wasn't Teddy Roosevelt. It was the other Roosevelt. Yeah, it was Teddy Roosevelt. And he takes them out, him, Nelson, Jimbo, Kearney, all the bullies out there, and actually gets them to, love school for a moment until one of them gets hurt on their expedition, and then the whole school gets in an uproar and fires him. But it's one of those moments where, even Bart starts being, really happy and waking up early to go out and join it. And it's Bart gets the few moments every now and then where it looks like something's getting him on the right track. But being a sitcom staple show formula, it has to go back to the way it was at the end of every episode.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Like the episode where he becomes the hall monitor and Lisa becomes the bad kid. And right. He has to kind of take the blame for her when she gets in trouble because he knows that, his reputation is already tarnished, whereas, he doesn't want her to ruin her life. And so, he does have these moments where, even when he tries to do well, he still gets in trouble at the end of the day just because of, his background and who he is as a character, even in the meta world of The Simpsons itself. So I think that's a good point. One thing I want to ask you guys about, Miles, I don't mean to hijack the show here, but I didn't realize this until again I did some research. But it makes so much sense because, as we know, this episode might not have been the funniest, but I agree that it was extremely poignant. And, the moment when Bart breaks down and he's crying and says, I really tried this time and I still got an F, and you really have this realization where he's a real boy, he's a real person with feelings, which is something so rare in animation then or now, certainly then, but even now, it doesn't surprise me that it was written by one of the main writers for the Wonder Years. So I'm curious what you guys think about that, because certainly the Wonder Years played that off so well. I don't even know if you'd call the Wonder Years a comedy per se. It was almost more like a drama that had some comedic elements to it. But, you had so many beautiful, poignant moments in the Wonder Years, almost through the whole series. And, to find out that this was written by, one of the main writers of the Wonder Years doesn't surprise me at all. Do you realize that? Do you know that? Or what are your thoughts on it?
I first of all, I love the Wonder Years. I watched it all the time when I was a kid, and I actually, within just probably the last 2 to 3 years, I just rewatched the entire series.
Right.
And it totally hit me in the nostalgia bone. It was still amazing, but that was actually something that surprised me. Is I was surprised by the fact that watching it now, it's not the type of show that I would have thought I would have enjoyed as a child because of how more drama-based it is than comedy-based, but there's something about it. And also, it takes place in a generation that I really can't connect to at all, yet somehow it reminds me of childhood, and I feel like it describes a lot of the same elements of school that I dealt with. I remember having the same sort of feelings towards, for example, there's an episode where Kevin doesn't want to shower in the locker room, and I totally remember being the first time that was a thing.
Sure.
that petrified me. I was like, wait, what? Like, that doesn't seem okay. I don't want to, like, put my bits out in front of everyone, which Richie, knowing me in college, I'm sure is cracking up that was a thing.
What you just said makes absolutely no sense, and it should be stricken from the record.
I got over it, let's say that. But at the time, I remember having that fear, and there's a lot of those moments in the Wonder Years that I guess connected somehow, even though it was literally decades apart from, or at least a decade apart. That was like the 70s, right? That was when that show was based?
I think like late 60s into the early 70s is when it was, because I know that as it went on, like we did land on the moon and and his sister was like an older hippie type, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So, but
it was the 60s. You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
So that's 2 decades removed from when I even entered the planet.
Right.
And just to touch on what you were saying there, Miles is like Martin in this episode. When Martin learns how to do these things, he goes way overboard way too quickly and has this demented look in his eye. When Miles figured out how to get naked in public, that's exactly what he did.
Which makes sense because, as we know, later on, Martin ends up getting naked in multiple episodes, if I remember correctly. He's the one in the pool.
Shit. You're giving this analogy more legs. I don't appreciate that.
Yeah. No, I just, and that was one of the reasons, Miles, when you had me look over episodes, and I said, I had a personal connection to this one just because I'll never forget, breaking this episode down in a history class that I took that was very memorable for me. But also, just the poignancy of that moment, of Bart, really coming to terms with the fact that, because before this, he always felt, oh, I'm not really trying, and, I'm just goofing off, but now when he actually wants to do well, he still can't, and to really come to terms with the fact that he might actually be as dumb as people say he is, is difficult for him, and I think that is one of the true beautiful moments of The Simpsons, along with that episode a little bit later down the road, that always comes to mind. One of the Christmas episodes, also with Bart, kind of in the center of when he's stealing the video game. And
that's
Sonic's fault, by the way. Not
yeah, right. Take it. But the way that episode ends, where it's like putting the picture of Bart on the other picture that got ruined, fixes the picture.
It balances it off. Yeah.
It's just
it's a beautiful moment.
Oh my gosh. It's and that's when you sit there and you go, no wonder this show's been around for 30 years almost, because it's it's not just funny, it's not just goofy, it's not just irreverent. There really is some great writing going on. That's just film, live action television, whatever. That is good writing. It almost doesn't belong in an animated show. And whereas you had moments getting close to that in shows like King of the Hill, I think, in my opinion. The Simpsons really does it on a whole other level, and I'm it's nice when you have those moments. So I was glad to be able to talk about this particular episode, because that it made it so real that Bart cries like that, and I'm sure, Miles, it sounds like you did some of the same research I did. They even had to block his face with a piece of paper because they didn't want it to be too schmaltzy. Yeah, they didn't want it to be too over the top, and they wanted it to be emotional without it being too emotional. So they just decided, well, we'll just not show Bart's face. And you know what? I think that's really great that they did that. That they figured out ways on a technical level of making it work.
It actually makes it more. It makes him more dramatic.
Yeah,
I would think, when you can't see his face, because you felt like that so many times before.
Yeah, and he's trying to hide it, which is what you would do. It's that's real crying. Yeah. You're he's not crying. You guys were talking about safe spaces and whatnot before. This is not about he's not trying to victimize himself. He doesn't want to cry. He doesn't want her to see him crying. You know what I mean? This is not about oh, give me the grade because I'm so sad. This is about I'm so embarrassed. He would probably almost want her to go away when he's crying like that. She just happened to stick around because she was confused. And then through his being upset about it, he makes a little remark about, fort necessity. That's when he gets the extra grade, So, I think that's a really, I think that's one of the great moments in The Simpsons overall, is that moment right there. It made the character so much more nuanced and real. And even the dynamic between Krabappel and he. There's this moment of even Krabappel lowers her guard a little bit and actually feels bad for Bart. Because at the end of the day, as much as she might hate him and as much as he might be a little bastard to her, he's still a little boy and he's still her student. And,
Sure.
I've always enjoyed episodes where they really play up Krabappel because it's so easy to make a teacher just, a hard-nosed bitch or, an idiot or whatever. But, the fact that they've made even Krabappel multi-leveled or Skinner or whatever it is, it's, I think that's, what's great. And I don't think it's just because it's been around for so long, because some of that stuff they did fairly early on. It'd be one thing if they only just started doing that now, but they did it fairly early on, where they really showed that Skinner, Krabappel, were real people who actually had their own problems and pathos.
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, we're only 14 episodes into this entire series right now. This is the first episode of season 2. There's only 13 in season 1. So I mean, yeah, this show is still very, very young. And
Yeah.
you're totally right. The way that they went from not only establishing who the Simpsons family was so quickly, that you already have an identity connection with each of the individual family members, but they're already starting to flesh out a lot of the side characters from around town. And Krabappel is a great example, and someone who I've met teachers. I know teachers that get feeling that way. I don't even necessarily think that Krabappel hates Bart as much as I think she's just so jaded to teaching in general, and Bart is like the antithesis of everything that she has to deal with in terms of the bullshit that comes along with her job.
She's broken it down to the bare necessities of her job, and Bart pushes those boundaries, so that's where their tension comes from. I actually don't like the line she has while Bart's crying in this, because it made me kind of not like her for a moment, where she said, "I thought you'd be used to failing by now." Like, I feel like that's a terrible thing for a teacher to say. It plays really well, but on modern standards, I feel like you can't say that to a student. But getting back to what you were saying, Matthew, about Bart crying, the thing I like about that moment is that when he has nothing, when he's completely broken, and he's not thinking, he's not trying, he comes up with the most poignant thing he's said the entire class period, when he talks about everything going on and gets his extra bonus point. And when he has nothing, and like kind of what you were touching on, when he's just being himself, he's learned this stuff, and when he's not trying to remember it so hard, it's right there for him to grab.
Absolutely, and I think that's such an important point. And again, why even kids who are in some of the advanced class or whatnot, like myself and some of my friends, really connected with him and didn't feel like, oh, that's just one of those idiots, or he's the kind of kid who would push us around or whatever it is. It was, no, we really connected with him. We saw him, I think, as one of us and as kind of a misfit. We keep talking about this. I think there's a really similar dynamic with Calvin from Calvin and Hobbes, because even
Yes.
even when I was
Yes.
a kid growing up, I always knew that Calvin was secretly really smart. I mean, the words that he used, his
I learned so many
knowledge of
words from that comic
dinosaurs.
strip.
Yeah, I mean, he knew so much about dinosaurs, and he knew all these really big words and philosophy, and he was so intelligent, and yet, he might be failing in class, and he might seem like an idiot to his parents and to his teacher, and to Susie Durkins. But I mean, he knew a lot. That kid did. I mean, I learned a lot from Calvin. Some of the words I learned were from Calvin growing up.
Yeah. And he never seemed stupid to Hobbes. He never seemed stupid to Hobbes.
Yeah, right. Of course not. Because let's be honest. Because it's the Tyler Durden thing.
Yeah, but it's almost refreshing, because most people like Bart, he's seeing himself in the future, and he's looking at himself so negatively in the future. But if Hobbes is a reflection of Calvin's own mind,
Yeah.
he's actually got really good self-awareness of his brilliance, almost, in a way. He's got really good self-esteem. I'm sorry, I went a little off track there.
Yeah. No, I see a similar thing there, and I really enjoy, and there's certain movies obviously where we see those kinds of characters of they might not be getting straight A's, and they might not be winning a lot of awards and the like, but they're the kids who could do certain really special things and had really unique skills, and it was obvious that they were putting their time and energy into something, and that they had the capacity to be really, really good and really top notch at something or a few things, just not what maybe everyone else wanted them to be good at. It's similar to Enid in Ghost World. She had this special little talent of drawing and making art and so forth, and she meanwhile she's failing her art class, and in fact has to take it over for summer school. Well, she was a good artist and had a lot to say and a lot of thoughts on art. It just wasn't what the establishment in her realm agreed with necessarily, or what they saw as art. So, she could draw a picture of Don Knotts, and it's an amazing picture, and it's interesting and it's funny, and the teacher just kind of fops it off as like a cartoon, but for her it was art. So I love seeing characters like that, and I definitely think that Bart was a real paradigm and even a paragon, if you will. He was just this superior force as far as the misfit kid who was special and actually pretty smart and pretty good at what he was doing, just not in the right world. He literally is a square peg in a round hole, and that was his problem.
That makes total sense. It's not and that goes back to he's not dumb. He's just not. He doesn't fit in the box that society necessarily wants him to fit in at that age.
Right. Exactly.
Well, Matthew, we've said a lot about this episode already. Is there anything else that you want to talk about from specifically Bart Gets an F?
You know what? I think we got it. I think we nailed it. There's certainly other aspects we can bring up, but I think for the most part, I'm satisfied.
Awesome. Well, part of the show is Richie does have his ultimate Simpsons fan guidebook or something of that nature. Rich, is there anything that you or your book would like to point out from this episode that we missed?
Well, first of all, I want to point out to all students, don't ever kiss your teacher, and to all teachers, don't ever kiss your students. You're not supposed to do that. Secondly, I want to point out when there's a snow day and everyone's holding hands and singing outside, Sideshow Bob's there singing and holding hands. Sideshow Bob is supposed to be in prison. So I don't know why he's there.
You're totally right.
Wow. My guidebook didn't even catch that, and it mentioned other characters that were out there singing from previous episodes. But I completely saw Sideshow Bob plain as day in there. So I don't know about that.
Well, he's really polite, so he may have gotten off on good behavior.
Yeah.
After like 3 weeks, I don't think so. One thing that makes me crack up every time I watch this episode is when Martin crashes his bike, and he's actually off camera when he crashes his bike. But the noise he makes doesn't sound like he's in pain at all, and I don't know why. It just makes me laugh hysterically. He goes like, "Ooh!" right when it crashes, and it's just the tone of it is so ridiculously hilarious. But I just can't ever get over that. But besides that, the thing my guidebook brings up is that there is a sign in the nurse's office that says, "Give a hoot, brush." Usually it's "Give a hoot, read a book." So I thought that was really funny because there's no reason to bring that line in, but it just made me laugh. And then lastly, I think we have to discuss this at the end of this little episode. We got to say rest in peace to Marcia Wallace, the voice actor for Mrs. K. She died back in October of 2013, so I guess her last season would have probably debuted in 2014. But I mean, Mrs. Krabappel is one of the staple side characters, especially considering all her interactions with Bart, which is what we've been talking about. And I just, we miss you. She had a really interesting character arc happening where she was either dating or married to Flanders towards the end of her character's story. And it's weird.
That sucks for Flanders because that's two wives that he's lost, or two companions that he's lost.
But it's so weird to think that you will never see or hear Mrs. K again. And I think they've mentioned that they're not going to replace her on the show, which I think is a good idea. I would not like to see anybody else do any of the voices. And that almost happened this season with, Yeardley Smith that does Burns and Skinner, where they were trying to quit the show, but they talked him into...
No, it was Harry Shearer.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
No, the fact that they never replaced Phil... gosh, I can't believe I'm blanking on his...
Phil Hartman.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. He was always my favorite characters on the
Such good characters. I mean, Lionel Hutz is one of my favorites of all time.
Oh, yeah.
Some great lines.
Troy McClure for me. Always Troy McClure. And the monorail song guy.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So, no, I think that's really good that The Simpsons rarely replaces people, and I think that they have some reverence for that. Also, I think they're aware of their audience base and know that if they were to do that, they'd probably get a bit of a backlash. Yeah. No, as I mentioned, he's been pretty forthright about this. Before we move on to the next episode, it's just, I've always thought kind of an interesting point. When FXX first did its first marathon of all the Simpsons episodes, it suddenly dawned on me that I just realized all of a sudden, wow, what is it like to be one of the Simpsons writers, knowing as soon as your episode's going to air, you're literally walking outside of your house with a blood red dripping, target on your back, And I actually, emailed Mike immediately and said, "Hey, Mike, watching the marathon, and it just was curious. Does that actually affect you?" And he actually broke it down, and for each of the main writers, how they feel about it. Some of them could care less, and some of them actually use it. And one of my friends who works at South Park said the same thing. Some of them use it as a means of actually trying to make the show better. My buddy at South Park was like, "Yeah, sometimes people will tell us like, oh, you already did such and such, so they won't do it again because they're like, our fans know more about the show than we do half the time."
That's a good thought. That's a good point.
Yeah, but Mike said, I forget who it was, and maybe it's better I not say, but one of the writers really reads like every single comment, and he said he really takes it to heart, and it really hurts his feelings when something's bad and makes him feel good when something's good. But like, there definitely is one of the writers really is paying very close attention to all the comments and whatnot, and so. I think that they do take into consideration what the fans are going to think, what the fans are going to say online and the like, and it's just getting harder and harder now with so much ubiquity of social media and the like, for good or ill. So I think they're aware that if they were to replace someone like Marsha Wallace or Phil Hartman, that they'd probably get in a little bit of trouble. But who knows? At the end of the day, it's their show, so.
Well, it is their show, but it's also bled into society so much that you're right. I think they're very aware of the fact that, well, yes, the buck stops at them, so to speak, when at decisions. They also, I think, are going to respect the fact that literally this ripples through so many fabrics of society that at this point, changes like that would be. I think it would literally offend people. I really do. And
that's a good point.
I don't even mean that on a silly level. I really think there would be people that would be upset that somebody tried to replace Krabappel, for instance.
No, it would be like if someone ever dared to, I don't know, reboot the Ghostbusters, for example. But
we won't talk about that.
No, we won't. But no, it's a good point. And again, I think it's one of the on a positive note, I think it's one of the strengths of the show is that. That I appreciate that Mike was telling me that, some of the writers care and some of them don't. And I think that's good that they're not all just totally beholden to the fans. Because at the end of the day, like, you know what? I want them to be a little bit ahead of the game. I don't want them to just be reacting to everything that social media or whatever is saying. But that they're paying at least some attention to it, and even that one or two of the writers might be paying really close attention to it is nice to know. And they do understand that this is a community. And they've helped to build this community, and they do want to be respectful of it. And, I know for a fact they all really appreciate their fans. And, Mike just loves every minute of it. And, there have obviously been rumors, and even Al Jean himself has said, hinted at maybe 30 might be the end of it and whatnot. But, whenever I've talked to Mike about it, it's like, yeah, that sometimes comes up, of course. But at the same time, it's like, they're still having so much fun with this. They really are. 30 years later, they're all having a great really time. And it would be hard to not go back to work and not do it. It's the same thing whenever that comes up with South Park. It's like, are the South Park guys going to end? And they literally have to come out and say on The Daily Show, like, we're not leaving, everybody. Don't worry. This is too much fun, 20 years later. So, I think that there's a lot to that. And I think that's why the show, the whole old episodes versus new episodes debate, blah, 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 blah. At the end of the day, it's still something where, I know, any fan of The Simpsons knows, whether you like the new episodes or not, if The Simpsons is on and you've got nothing else to do or you're in a hotel room and it's the only thing on, you're going to watch it and you're going to enjoy yourself. Let's be honest. A bad episode of The Simpsons is still better than a good episode of much else that's on right now or, something else. It's still The Simpsons. You can still sit down and enjoy yourself, even if it's not your favorite episode,
Absolutely.
I'm just
you're
glad
going to
they
get
worked
something.
stuff out with Harry Shearer. If Ned Flanders wasn't on the show anymore, or they had to replace his character voice, I don't know what I'd do with myself. The older I get, the more I love Flanders. And I've always liked Flanders, but just everything about him just makes me crack up.
I still say whoops-a-doodle regularly. I mean, that it honestly is my
I say Oakley Dokley Doo all the time.
Well, I mean, come on. The name of this show is inspired by Flanders,
yeah,
for Christ's sake. I mean, that's he's obviously an influence on us.
Every time someone asks me how I'm doing, I say fine and dandy like sour candy.
That's awesome.
Every time.
That's good stuff. The only other thing I wanted to say, and then we're going to move on to the other episode, but I did really, really love the end of this episode. Bart hits his D, he makes his point, he earns his bonus point, he passes, he runs around screaming how excited he is. They put his D, the paper that the test that keeps him from having to repeat the 4th grade, on the refrigerator, and Bart proudly proclaims that part of this D belongs to God, because earlier in the episode he had prayed for anything to keep him out of school, and that's how he got the snow day.
Which I think we've all done before.
Oh, absolutely. Lisa had commented that prayer, the last refuse of a scoundrel, which I thought was fantastic, and she's the one that more or less pressures him into skipping the snow day to try to make up his test, and ultimately, you could argue, is the reason that Bart knew what he knew to get that bonus point and to get through it. So I don't know if Bart should be thanking God as much as he is Lisa, but regardless, it was a really funny line.
Yeah, and I think that's funny too, because in both these episodes, this might be a good transition to the next one. But in both these episodes, there's a moment of prayer. Whether it's Homer saying, "Dear God, please give a bald guy a break," or it's Bart, praying, directly for the snow day.
All right, everyone, I think we're going to have to cut it right there for now. This is a really good conversation we've got going with Mathew Klickstein, but it did go quite a bit longer than our normal episodes, so we're going to go ahead and make this a 2-parter. Make sure you come back next week for the Best Darn Diddly Review Show for the rest of our conversation with Mathew Klickstein and a review of Simpson and Delilah. Till next time, go ahead and follow me on Twitter at Mr. Most Days Off. Also follow at TheWiz_Kid23 to follow Richie. Check out Mathew Klickstein's book Slime. It's really, really fun read. A really interesting set of conversations he had with a lot of the people behind our favorite shows at Nickelodeon. And make sure you come back next week for the rest of our conversation on the Best Darn Diddly Review Show.